Big time fight coming up this weekend at flyweight. We have Canada's Jasmine Jasudavicius making her UFC debut, taking on the American wrestling stud Kay Hansen. Now, there's so many different ways that we can break down this fight, talk about the debuting fighter representing Niagara Top Team, and you guessed it, Niagara, Canada, not the Buffalo side. We're talking just strictly in Canada. But for Jasudavicius, she was somebody that came into MMA, and I really had to do a little bit of a deep dive because making her UFC debut at 32, she's what? 5 weeks shy of her 33rd birthday. That's just not something that you see very often, but it's actually going to be a theme on this card because you hear Dana White signing people on Contender Series, talking about different fighters on Looking for a Fight, saying, hey, the kid's too old, but I'm going to take them anyway. And for Jasmine, she was somebody that had a bit of a different route coming into not just the UFC, but MMA in general. I mean, a 4-0 amateur career. And she's somebody that's really been on the radar of not just Canadians, but MMA fans for a very long time. I want to credit her management company being Dodge Sports because friend of the show, Michael Fidel, MMA Prospects, there's a little bit of a partnership there with Dodge Sports. And I've just heard a lot about Jasmine for the longest time, since she was an amateur into the time that she turned pro. But if you read the story about how she got into it, it was off a Tinder date. And I found that very interesting. I read an article from 2020 in August from Aaron Bronstetter. She and her friend, the friend was nervous on the date. There were other friends involved. Then she meets a boyfriend. Then the boyfriend goes to travel in Prince Edward Island to train with, you guessed it, what UFC fighter is from Prince Edward Island? Jason Sago. And in that training camp, Jasmine decides, you know what? I want to hit the mats. I don't want to hang out at Brackley all day. So she hits the mats. She has a little bit of a knack for it. Jason has a fight in Ontario. And then Bob's your uncle, I guess. We're off to the races. And if you look at it for Jasmine, she was a Canadian freestyle wrestling champion. So she does have that in her back pocket. You might hear that she doesn't have combat sports experience. But if you do watch her fights, yes, striking might not be her number one go-to, but if you do watch her fight, it is an absolute barrage of just pressure from the jump. If she's able to get her hands on you, the very best. That's just kind of like icing on top of the cake, really.
She does have a very, very aggressive game, and that's what makes this fight so interesting, because with Kay Hansen, she definitely is the more experienced out of these two fighters, even though she is a decade younger than her opponent, but Hansen's had a very weird career in her own right. People forget, she was a super hyped up prospect over in Invicta when she was like 18, 19 years old. Like, she was way, way younger, and she was one of these people who, okay, she was very green at the time, but Invicta felt like if they could build her up to a certain point, they might have a star on their hands. And the great thing about Invicta, and we say this about Bellator too, some of these organizations can kind of get away with having less than well-known prospects, or maybe prospects who have a negative record, because you don't always have like national televised TV shows. So you can build these people up, even if they don't always have the greatest starts, and you can actually build them into a really good fighter. But with Hansen, it just wasn't really working for her. And like you had said, she does have a really good American wrestling game, but her whole MMA game is based off whether or not she can get the offensive takedown or not. She does have an okay grasp of striking, but my real big issue with Kay Hansen on the feet is that she doesn't really overcommit to anything. And I know a lot of the times we say that about, oh, that's a positive, but with her wrestling game, it would almost be nicer if she did crash her way into the pocket a little bit more, because we saw in the McKenna fight, she waited on McKenna a lot. And that was one of those weird prospect versus prospect fights where it almost feels like both fighters are 2 years away from being 2 years away because they're both so young. But Hansen was just sort of thoroughly out MMA'd in that fight, and that's what concerns me about her moving forward. And it's nothing against Corey McKenna, it's just she's also another fighter who's very, very young in her MMA career and in her UFC career. So if I see you get out grappled by her, and if I see you just not being comfortable enough on the feet with someone like McKenna, I do worry about you, especially at this division, because with Hansen, if she is going to continue to be this fighter who needs the offensive takedown to really open up the rest of her game, there's going to be a certain limit there. Like, we see a lot of good fighters in this strawweight division get to a certain level where, hey, I have really good wrestling. Look at Randa Marcos, for instance. She has great wrestling, but she was never really comfortable on the feet. Hansen really needs to bring everything together if she wants to jump to that next level.
Which is a really good point that we need to go back to, because you mentioned it, and then you kind of just continued on. Kay Hansen and wrestling at strawweight, giant advantage. Kay Hansen at flyweight, yeah, she has flyweight experience. I went back through it. She has 8 fights on her record at strawweight. She has 3 at flyweight, in which one of those flyweight fights, she weighed in at 116 pounds. And again, one of those fights is a decision loss to Erin Blanchfield. There's no shame in that. And Erin Blanchfield's probably one of the best wrestlers in flyweight, period, like in the entire world. So again, you kind of take the good with the bad, but I go back through it. Kay Hansen definitely has taken on a tougher level of competition, and if you look at it for Jasudavicius, it's really kind of an odd one, because you look at the wins, you look at the losses, maybe not the highest level of competition, and then you go into it. Her only loss as a pro to Elise Reed, who was making her second time out as a pro, but had an extensive amateur record, and that was it for Elise. Jasudavicius was able to get the takedowns early. She pressured a lot. She did eat a ton of shots on her way in. That was really to her detriment. That's how Reed was able to win that fight, and as some of the Jasudavicius fights have gone on, especially the Reed fight, the fight against Julia Pilastri, her last time out on Dana White's Contender Series, she's not on the winning end of the third round in either of those fights, and I think that's really important. Now, the one thing I do have to say, with Hansen having more experience at strawweight than at flyweight, we're moving up to flyweight for the first time in the UFC. Jasudavicius is a flyweight, and a big flyweight at that, a long-rangey flyweight. She did take that fight against Elise Reed at strawweight, since then has been at flyweight. So an interesting one there too.
So in my mind's eye right now, I really only see this fight going two different ways. Either Kay can get the takedown over and over and over again, and we see a fairly one-sided fight from her. But if Jasmine can at least go 50-50 with her takedown defense, it's going to be interesting on the feet, because here's the thing. If this fight does become one of those scramble fests, both going for a lot of takedown type of fights, then I think it could be a very entertaining one. If we get 15 minutes of these two striking, it is not going to be the most aesthetically pleasing fight at all. And that's going to be the big thing. Like, if both these fighters are very even with their wrestling and neither is able to secure the takedown, I have a really hard time saying who would be able to really differentiate themselves in a 15-minute striking contest. Because Hansen, I think, is a little bit more upright with her stance, a little bit more to the point. Her hands stay very, very high when she strikes. But like you had said early on, Jasmine is very relentless with her pressure on the feet. And I don't really know what Hansen can do to keep that pressure off of her if she isn't able to secure the takedown. But I keep on going back to, if Hansen is able to get that takedown, she does have really good top pressure, she does have good ground and pound, and she does have an advancing game. She's not somebody who's just going to sit in the guard and just sort of wait for the ref to either stand them up or they'll just stall for a little while. She will try to progress positions, and I do think that's going to be her big key to this fight.
And the weird thing for Kay Hansen, you look at her UFC debut, we just assumed against Jinh Fry, it's going to be early takedown on top. That was a position that Fry had struggled in previous fights, and in that one, she had to try again, and it wasn't until the third round that she was able to get it done. Her last time out against Poppins, she's on the losing end, and for Jasudavicius, she kind of just walks people down nice and square. Nice and square is not always good. The other thing, Kay Hansen, they might talk about her boxing experience from 2018 to 2019. She has a pro boxing career on BoxRec. 1-4, all 5 fights by decision. So whether you like it, whether you don't, that will be interesting. But I think really in this one, it's going to take strength and who has the will to win. And I hate to say that. That is the most cliche thing I've ever said on this channel. But that really is it. Because for Jasudavicius, you look at her last fight, she has a great showing against Pilastri early. There's 29-27s out there for scores. And she looked great. Slowed down a little bit in the third, but it was a great fight. So when I look at the odds for this one, Kay Hansen opened a -115. She's a -248 favorite. For Jasudavicius, opened a -105. She's a +200. I'm going to assume the Tapology votes are a little bit closer. Now, they're a surprise to us. They are to you, Matt. I'm going to set the over-under at 67.5% Kay Hansen.
I think they're going to be over.
You're going to say over. Ooh, they're close. 774 total votes, 73% Hansen, 78% by decision. For the 37% that have Jasudavicius, 85% by decision, and it's got to be noted, I mean, a lot of decisions on these two women's records. It really is a tough fight to call, and then when you look at the odds where they're at right now, that makes it even more of a head-scratcher.
100%, but... Yeah, okay, maybe this is me just showing a short memory, but I kind of go back to another fight that we saw that reminds me of this one a little bit from last weekend. Brian Kelleher, a smaller guy, who is the more skilled guy, was fighting someone who was bigger than he is in Kevin Kroom, but the skills ended up beating just the size that Kroom had, so I think I'm going to have to pick Kay Hansen in this fight, because here's the thing, if she can get the takedown, she's going to win this fight. It's going to be one of those cases where we'll kind of be able to tell the whole story of the fight from the first wrestling exchange that these two have. If Hansen's able to secure that takedown, get top position. I fully expect her to be able to maintain that position for the whole entire round, and then she'll probably be able to do it for 3 other ones. I don't expect a finish in this fight at all. But for Jasmine, if she is able to keep it up on the feet and really use her own physicality and size to her advantage, I can see a world where she is able to get the win.
If you see Jasudavicius having a ton of success in the first round, again, against Plastri, it was a 10-8. Like, she did a great job in that one. You talk about takedowns, so on and so forth. We'll have to see how that takedown defense holds up for Kay Hansen. But for me, I do have Hansen in this fight. I think when pressure meets pressure, I'm going to take the fighter that I've just seen out there against the higher level competition. So for me, I'm going with the smaller fighter, making the jump up. Looks great over on Instagram as far as strength and conditioning is concerned. And Kay Hansen looking like she's doing a little bit of consulting in that area as well. So kudos to her. But both of us going with not our fellow Canadian in this one. We're going with Kay Hansen. Let us know down below in the comments section who you have. Do you have the natural flyweight of Jasmine Jasudavicius? Do you have the American strawweight upperweight class in Kay Hansen? Should be an interesting fight. We have a lot more of debuting fighters, so you're not going to want to miss. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, and as we always say, let's get into it.